Hello, this is Dave, W7UUU, and today we're with Larry, and he's going to introduce himself for our next video in the series. So take it away, Larry.
Thanks, Dave. I'm Larry Watson, also known as KD4VOM, and I'll tell you a little bit about how I got where I am today, especially the part that deals with amateur radio. I'll throw some other things in because they may be of some interest to some folks. My journey began in high school back in the late 40s. I was interested in electronics even back then. I belonged to a projectionist club and we fixed high school PA systems, that sort of thing. And we had a teacher who ran a radio class. We actually had 4x8 piece of plywood, which had a super heterodyne receiver built in, and we had to learn all of the processes, the variable frequency oscillators, and all the various coal pits and all that sort of stuff. And I remember that he would come in over the weekend and create a defect in that system. And then when we came to school on Monday, our job was to, between throwing charged capacitors at each other, was to figure out what was causing the problem. So that was my beginning. There was another part to it. We lived in a housing project in Bremerton, one of the early days. This was right after Pearl Harbor. There was a neighbor that lived just a couple of houses down from us, and I noticed that he had these funny little things outside of his house, looked like antennas. And so I wandered down to visit with him a couple of times. You must keep in mind that World War II was on. All he could do was receive, but he had he had one extra bedroom, and it was all his radios were in there. So I spent a lot of time down there, sort of listening with him and asking questions and things like that. Always an interest in electronics. I know I got in trouble for wiring a second phone to our house, and my father brought in somebody from Ma Bell to tell me that that was not something that we ought to be doing. So that was the beginning, and then there was a sort of a hiatus. We graduated from high school in 1950, and the Marines were up to their waist in water in Tucson Harbor. It was Korean War was going, so I enlisted in the Air Force together with a friend. We got separated at the induction facility, and I wound up for I think I spent 8 years as a dental technician. There's a long story about how the military decides what you're good for, but I eventually wound up, after my 4 years was up, I wound up going back to Bremerton. I spent about a week or two there, a month maybe, and I went back in the military. Spent a year in Saudi Arabia, came back, and then I wound up with Francis C. Warren Air Force Base. And my boss kept chipping on me to get a commission to go at least take the test. And I was tried to convince him that it was not it really wasn't something I was cut out to do. So to make a long story short, I took the test and passed the test. And at the maximum age, I got a billet for officer candidate school, went to OCS in Lackland, and wound up in the Air Force as an officer. Went to a pilot training for a little bit, and then I got discouraged because I wasn't doing well, and they told me I was ready to go back and do something like admin. And my instructor told me that they needed navigators. You have to have a navigator's license. You have to be commissioned as a navigator in order to go to electronic warfare. So I wound up going to Mobile, Alabama for electronic warfare. Another 6 months of electronic training and flying and learning how to operate electronic warfare. Then when I graduated, I wound up in a B-52 as an electronic warfare officer. The job there was to defend the airplane. We had to learn at least 4 or 5 of the strategic air command mission sorties that we had to know by heart. And we pretty much felt like if that ever blew the whistle on the war this was at the time Khrushchev and the country was fighting verbally, And then came the day when they decided they were going to put missiles in Cuba, and we were loaded with nuclear weapons on alert for at least a week before Khrushchev backed down. The result of that was I wound up moving on to another B-52 unit in California, and didn't stay there long. They moved me over, and they offered me a job with the reconnaissance technical group there at Beale, where we processed all of the film electronic collections for the SR-71. I was assigned as an electronic warfare officer, but I wound up being the operations officer and then later the commander. And that's what we did. We analyzed the electronic warfare intercepts, and it was an exciting job. We had a whole team of electronic officers that spent time going through. It was tape and a 3200 CDC computer to try and analyze what was going on with the electronics. I came up for retirement at 20 years, and I was going to retire. And the Strategic Air Command personnel people called me and said, "Would you stay on for a little while?" And I said, "Well, what? I don't know. I'm pretty well ready to go now. What do you want me to do?" I said, "Well, what would we need to do to offer you the job?" They offered me a job flying out of Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska, where we flew electronic collection missions against the Soviet ballistic testing missions into Kamchatka. It's in the news, you see it today, that the fighters off your wing. Well, we did that, and it was a really interesting job. Later, but another assignment overseas in Wiesbaden for 4 years doing imagery and other analytic work. So now I go back to the States. What happened is I wound up being stationed at the National Photographic Interpretation Center in Washington, D.C., as it was a CIA, Air Force, Army, Navy job. I was the deputy commander. When I retired, I discovered there was an amateur radio group in Alexandria, Virginia. So I went over and got my novice license. And that was my return to amateur radio, if you will, in the late 80s. When I retired from the Air Force in 89, we packed up our gear and moved back to California, which we had some property there. And we spent a few months there, and then we moved back up here to the Washington State. My first experience after I got there was the Puyallup Fair. I went to the Puyallup Fair, and the radio club in Tacoma had a booth. And standing behind the counter was a guy by the name of Jerry Seligman. Jerry Seligman was, if anything, was an interesting guy. I asked him, I said, "Well, what are you guys doing? Is there some kind of an organization here?" He said, "Oh yeah." So he gave me the address. He says, "Yeah, go down there. They'll take care of it." He was very short, very sweet. Not so sweet. But I got the impression I was being brushed off. So I went down to the radio club, and I got got in got in to meet some people, and I wound up joining the club. Then, not too long after that, I wound up going into Jerry's basement, which was well known around the area for where he taught amateur radio general and extra class licenses. And it was an education and a half, four steps away from his station, which was significant. But it was an interesting job, interesting training environment, because Jerry had all the tools, he knew the answers, but he had every week one of the members of this small 8 or 10 person class actually wound up preparing the next day's training. So you got forced to learn the material because you were going to deliver it the next day. And I remember Nick Winter at one of his, after he passed away, at one of his sessions, we were in a crowd of people who came to honor Jerry. And Nick was talking a lot about him. And then finally he said, "How many people here had courses from went to his classes, and at least 80% of the people
Wow.
raised their hands. So I moved into the other jobs in the radio club. I was a secretary. I was interested in history. I did a lot of photographic work. Field day was took care of things at the mess tent for a long time. The only failure I think I had in the radio club at Tacoma was I was very interested in emergency operations, and I couldn't convince anybody that was worth their time. It always has been, and so after I retired from my job after 4 to 6 years as secretary and the planning guy, I wound up moving into amateur radio emergency services, and I've been doing that for the last 8 or 10 years. I run a net for the Roy area here. I belong to the Pierce County in District 5 Amateur Radio Emergency Service. And my focus in my retirement years is learning more about and learning how the skills necessary to operate using amateur radio in the event of a major disaster. And we're overdue by a few hundred years a major earthquake in this country. There are other things that could cause such a disaster, but we prepare for that. We have at least 6 or 7 nets a week. Um, I have, I think I've been doing our net, the Roy Area Communications Net, for about 8 years.
So early on in your early ham career, 80s and 90s, before you got involved with the club so much, what other things did you do in radio? What things interested you?
There was this hiatus between the time I got into airborne reconnaissance, which is just the reverse of doing amateur radio. It's not a two-way conversation, but I spent most of my time learning electronics and how to use voice as a tool for intelligence collection. And once again, it's from the time I left the airborne reconnaissance and went into the photographic intelligence. I just was away from amateur radio all those years. And it wasn't until I got to Alexandria in 89 or 90 that I wound up getting into amateur radio. Something I always wanted to do. Bought a radio, bought an antenna, listened, couldn't figure out what was going on, and then finally figured it out that I enjoyed it. I've done that ever since. It's been 20 years. Straight key night was fun to do. I always went. I'm not a CW guy. I took the class. Even when I was a novice, I did 5 words. I couldn't give you 5 right now. I don't know whether that helps, but that's the fact of it.
What are some memories that you have at the clubhouse? Any events that you attended that stand out as a fond memory?
There are lots of them. I remember the gent that was in the radio club that had the distinction of being the first guy to ever be hijacked on an airplane. He was a pilot and he got hijacked.
Morale.
And I've got pictures of him using the left foot Morse code key. The field days were always interesting to me. I remember the bicycle generator that Kemmer put together. Him and Rich Patrick were, I should say, Rich Patrick was probably one of the strongest influences on me to enjoy amateur radio.
In what way?
He just had a natural ability to deal with people. We built tape measure Yagis and got a chance. I followed him around one day and we went out to Stillicum Park and had some exercises. He was always hiding bunnies that would sound like Disney characters, I guess. It was fun. I enjoyed going down there. I was always interested in meeting people when they come to the club. I know Al Burleson. He and I ran the Saturday morning food line and the coffee bar for years, and meeting people and getting to know them. I was there when Linda and her father came in, introduced them to the club. And
when you were learning Morse code, were you wondering, why do I have to do Morse code to get a ham radio license? And will I use this ever?
No. I always admire people who use Morse code. I should tell you that we had, when we flew those airborne reconnaissance missions against the Soviet Union, we had a lot of people back there who were signals intelligence people. And we always knew something was up when all of their tape recorders started working. And I always wished I had learned the code because when the weather was bad and we couldn't fly, we had a SIGINT site there at Shimia, the island where our airplane was based. And we would go up and sit stations with them where they were copying codes. And that's when I learned the idea that you could tell a person by his hand. They could tell you when this guy or that guy was on board and what their history was and how they operated. And it always was a MIDI dream to learn to do it, but not enough stick to itiveness to stay in the game. But the code classes that Rich Patrick ran was were great. We we took I took them because we wanted to know, but I just didn't have the enough passion, I guess, to do
So, what was it like riding in a B 52
it.
during the Cold War?
Well, I have to tell you, I'll give you a data point. We had to know at least 4 missions over the Soviet Union. None of us um, had any um, Walter Mitty ideas about what the war was going to be like. But we had to go into the wing commander and we had to brief those missions. Every people we had a navigator, a bombardier, we had a gunner, 2 pilots, and the electronic warfare officer. Then each person had a segment in this presentation to the wing commander before that was the whole purpose of that presentation was to be certified on that mission. And I remember the story. We came out of one of these presentations. We did pretty well, and my boss, as the aircraft commander, said that the co-pilot asked him. He said, "When are we going to finish the briefing?" And he says, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, we only briefed up until the last bomb release." He says, "Well, when are we going to finish it?" He said, "Well, that's when we run out of gas." That's why they give you that 38. And that was the way it was. When during the
Wow.
Cuban Missile Crisis, we were on alert in the officers' club 24/7. All the aircraft, we had 24 aircraft. They were all loaded with nuclear weapons, and we were ready to go to war.
You just
Thank
didn't
God
know
for
what was going to
Kennedy.
happen.
We were so pleased that President Kennedy was managed to defuse the situation without the alternative, because it's just something you can't envision. But in the airplane, it was a lot of fun. We were constantly looking for. It wasn't much different than search and DX. I think we knew what we were about, but we were gathering information about the Soviet missile system at a time. MERV was really important. The community was interested in knowing if the Soviets had multiple reentry vehicles. And basically, what happens is they fire the missile into Kamchatka, which was the target zone. And once the missile gets close to the terminus of its flight, they eject, they stop the recorders and they eject the recordings and they collect them by parachute and they play back all of the information in case that capsule gets damaged. And our first shot, we went into a screen room, and that our job was to try and make sure that we gathered that information so the people in the technical analysis world for that system could figure out what was working and what wasn't. It was very interesting. We had some really bright people, and we always launched on no notice. We were sitting on alert all the time, and it was a very gratifying mission. Kind of scary because they come up and visit you once in a while, say hello, waggle the wings. And Shimmy is not noted for weather. In fact, I think Shimmy is the only Air Force location where the chaplain was known to Wendable. Shimia was next to the last island in the Aleutian chain,
Okay.
and the closest we had airfield to the Kamchatka Peninsula.
Well, do you have any parting words for the members of the radio club at Tacoma, and how
Well,
you picture amateur radio down the road, perhaps?
I don't know. I guess the only thing that strikes me is that the technology is advancing at a rapid rate, and as I look back on my time with amateur radio, I observe that there are some that rail against the future, and there are others who adopt it. I'm on the adopter side. To equate Morse code with the digital system is hard for some people, but for me, it's ones and zeros. It's dots and dashes. We've just learned to do it a heck of a lot faster than we used to. The other thing that bothers me a little bit is it's the amateur radio service. It's not the amateur radio hobby. There's a reason that the FCC allows us the spectrum we use, and there's a hell of a demand for the spectrum. The stock market people have discovered HF and they're out for our spectrum. So getting involved in emergency, I'd sure hate to try and justify the continued exposure and access to our spectrum based on field day hobbies. The only thing we need to do is we need to convince the FCC that we have a legitimate role to play in an emergency and in peacetime. And peacetime is when you prepare for an emergency, and you need to do that. My pitch to the radio club is get your MCOM hat on and figure out how to make it work.
Well, very good. Well, I'd like to thank you very much for your time today, Larry. It's a pleasure meeting with you and getting your comments onto video.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to do it.
You're very welcome.